These instructions are for updating the firmware in both your MSB reference DAC and digital director. To start, if you have not installed your digital director in your system, first begin by updating the DAC firmware. This is important. Your DAC will not recognize the digital director and the firmware updates will not work. Your reference DAC firmware must be updated to 31.21 or later. Please check your DAC firmware before installing your digital director. Firmware files can be found on our website. A link will be in the description below. Begin by downloading both the digital director firmware and the DAC firmware. Add these files to your BitPerfect playback software. Please note, these must be played by a BitPerfect source. If the update fails, it is not being played BitPerfect. Do not power off your system while updating the firmware. Please note that the firmware update will take longer than shown. This is sped up for demonstration purposes. After the DAC firmware is updated, you can now install your digital director. Please see our other video on digital director setup for more specific instructions. For any updates after installing the digital director, you will need to follow this order for updating. Power on the DAC and the director. Always begin by updating the DAC firmware first. The firmware file will not be able to update the DAC while digital director processing is on. Enter the menu, select DD, then select pass-through mode for the digital director. This will allow the firmware update to reach the DAC BitPerfect. Now, play the DAC firmware update. Please note that the firmware update will take longer than shown. This is sped up for demonstration purposes. After the DAC firmware is installed, you can now play the digital director firmware. Please note that the firmware update will take longer than shown. This is sped up for demonstration purposes. Finally, go back into the menu and enable the digital director filtering again. After the firmware updates are complete, you can check for a successful connection between the digital director and DAC indicated by a small plus sign on the display. If you do not see this plus sign, the digital director is not performing the improved digital filtering. Please check the menu to see if the filtering is enabled. If it is, please check and confirm the firmware numbers reflect the new update files. If you see an error message on your display, please try replacing your control link and Pro ISL cables. If you need further clarification or are encountering issues with your update, please reach out to our technical support team.